Kathy Doyle. She is a master gardener for Kent County from the class of 2019. She's waving at you if you can see the pictures of everybody. So before we start, we just have a couple of little business items to take care of. First of all, we are going to keep everyone muted during the presentation except for the presenter, as you saw in the email. And the purpose of this is not that we don't want to hear from you. The purpose is that we can have distractions such as dogs barking in the background and kids screaming and doorbells ringing. So to avoid all those interruptions, we're just going to keep everybody muted. If you have a question that you want to ask our presenters, you can use the chat feature. If everybody can find that on your computer, sometimes you have to roll your mouse around to find the chat button. So you can make comments and ask questions, and then at the very end of the presentation, we're going to allow the time for everybody's questions to get answered. So hopefully that'll work for everybody. After the presentation, you're going to receive another email from me that's going to have the presentation itself attached as a PDF file that you can look at. And you will also receive a link to do an evaluation of the workshop. We really appreciate if you take the time to do that, because that gives us a lot of information on how to, what's good and what's bad and how we can do this better next time. This is our first time doing an online class, so please bear with us as we figure out the logistics that we're going through. I also want to let you know that the workshop is being recorded for future reference. If you don't want your picture to be seen, you can hide your video. If you don't want people seeing your picture, and we'll just see your name. So that's another thing. It's not going to be made public. It's just for archive for our records right now. So we're going to go ahead and let Kathy start. She's going to share her PowerPoint with you on the screen. And Kathy, do you have anything to say before you start?
Welcome everybody. Thanks for being our guinea pigs. As Debbie said, we haven't tried this before. It's a little weird. You know, I was a 32-year classroom teacher, so here I am talking to a screen, and I have no idea if I know any of you. Hello if I do, hello if I don't. Also, I can't ask you your background and see how many of you are experts and how many of you don't know anything about this. So I'm just going to assume that people do not know very much, and I'm going to kind of start from ground zero, and hopefully that's going to work for you folks. And as Debbie said, when she does the evaluation, you can give us feedback about what you would like in the future. So forgive me for looking at my notes. I have to share the screen, and if I share with notes, you see all my notes. So I'm actually reading my notes, looking down. So I prefer to be making eye contact with everyone, but I don't even know how to do that with this. So off we go. Off we go. All right, let's try that. Okay, so this is the description of the workshop that you signed up for. I just wanted to review it real quick. I'm going with the superhero theme, and native plants will come in all different shapes, colors, sizes, and really literally they can save lives. They save birds, bees, butterflies, and even our watersheds. So what I'm going to do is first make the case for native plants, just kind of why they're so important. It's not just that I think they're beautiful. Some people don't think they're beautiful, but I think they're beautiful. But even more importantly, I think that they're extremely important to our entire ecosystem. So I'm going to make the case about that first, and then I'm going to give you some specific information about some specific plants. So here's just some beautiful pictures of some beautiful native plants. These are all from Mount Cuba, which is a place up in Heuchera that specializes in native plants. So my argument is that native plants are like superheroes. So that's that's the case I'm going to make. First, let's do some defining. Okay, native plants versus non-native. I'd ask for a show of hands if somebody could tell me the difference, but I can't do that. So a native plant is a plant that's part of the balance of nature that has developed over hundreds of thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. So, you know, 100 years is not enough to make a plant fit in as a native plant. Non-native plants are plants that have been introduced with human help, intentionally or accidentally, to a new place where those plants did not previously exist. Some other really helpful vocabulary words are the word invasive and aggressive. So you've probably heard the phrase or the term invasive plants. Those are non-native plants, and they tend to grow quickly and they spread to the point of disrupting other plant communities. Not all non-natives are invasive. Some are perfectly well behaved. Aggressive is usually the word you hear associated with a plant that spreads more quickly than you want. So it's a little more subjective. It could be non-native, it could be native, and it tends to overpower any of the competition. So here's just a picture. You've probably seen these sites, you know, along Route 1 or downtown Dover or along the St. John's River, but these are non-native plants that are choking out the native ecosystem. So there's kudzu to your left. There's English ivy that is strangling that tree there. And then the lower right side are Australian Phragmites. I always thought they were really pretty beach grass, but they have completely replaced all of our native beach grasses, and they've created a monoculture along our rivers and bays, which is not so good for our native wildlife. So this is the point I think I just made. Native plants have been replaced by non-native plants. And just for example, the property we purchased 20 years ago, the folks who used to live there were fabulous gardeners. They filled the entire property with non-native, gorgeous plants from Japan, from China, from all over the world. Absolutely beautiful plants, not a single bird in our backyard. And I'll talk about why that is. Looked beautiful, but they were planted intentionally. So Doug Tallamy, I'm going to quote from him a few times. He is a professor up at the University of Delaware. He's become nationally renowned in talking about native plants and talking about specifically insects and birds. And what he found in his research was that over the past 50 years, the number of birds in Delaware have been reduced, and the number of bird species in Delaware has declined by 50%. So there are fewer birds and there are fewer bird species. And we'll talk about why that is. So in addition to birds, you've probably all heard about the honeybee situation, you know, that honeybees have been dying mysteriously. And it's not just honeybees, but native bees. So honeybees are not native to the United States, but there are thousands of native bees in the United States. Delaware is home to about 200 native bees. Bumblebees, sweat bees, mining bees. There are just, you know, dozens and dozens of different kinds of bees, and they are all in decline. Specific bees are built to pollinate specific flowers. So when you plant your garden, you want to have, you know, a wide variety of kinds of flowers to make the various bees happy. Let's see, and butterflies. So the monarch butterfly, the eastern monarch butterfly, which is the eastern part of the United States, that has seen in the last 20 years an 80% decline in numbers. And then in addition, half of all the moth and butterfly species are in decline. And 1/3 of all the moth and butterfly species are threatened with extinction. So this is all very much connected to native plants. In fact, a new study that was in the National Geographic suggests that 40% of insect species are in decline. So who cares? Nobody likes bugs anyways. And bees sting, right? Everybody's, we all think, ooh, bugs, why do we want them? But first of all, most bees don't sting unless you're really mean to them, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the issue is we need biodiversity for our whole ecosystem. I'm sure some of you guys have played Jenga before. The idea is you have a tower and you try to pull out a block without toppling the whole tower down. When it comes to our ecosystem, as one species disappears, additional species start to disappear because they relied on those species. And a researcher from the University of Sydney said that if we don't stop these species disappearances, then entire ecosystems are going to collapse due to starvation. So without all these pollinators, all these various insects, without pollinators, we have no food. So this is more than just pretty plants. So there's lots of different causes for the decline in the birds, the bees, the butterflies. One cause is non-natives are crowding out the natives. And I showed you a picture of that. One cause is pesticides. One cause is climate change. And another cause is habitat loss. Now, I'm not going to talk at all about pesticides. And I'm not going to say that pesticides are never necessary. That's for someone else to talk about. But there tends to be sort of rampant use of pesticides that's very not used properly. And then climate change, we're not going to get into talk about that because that could take hours, and we could probably debate about it. But what I am going to talk about is habitat loss, which is the most visible cause of species decline. And it's also the area that we all can have the most positive and also negative impact. So we've all seen this throughout Kent County, right? You see wooded lots for sale, and then down they go, and up come developments. There's deforestation throughout the world, not only in the Amazon, but really everywhere. There is, everywhere has been replaced with roads and highways and shopping malls. So this is an aerial view of Jersey City, but it could be almost anywhere. One of Doug Tallamy's quotes is that in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, in just a 10-year period, impervious surface, so sidewalks, roads, etc., increased more than 40% in a 10-year period. So this is what's happening to our habitat. And this is of course, a view of the national parks. And there's not a lot of green on the East Coast, right? Once upon a time, the entire East Coast was covered by forests. And when birds and butterflies are, migrating, they need to have places where they can stop and feed. And so where there's no habitat, there's no place for them. So I was about to get ahead of myself. I'm not saying the answer is we shouldn't be building houses, right? But the answer really is to think about how we use our own private property. So, people love their lawns, and there's a vast lawn here with one lonely tree. Trees do like to have friends. They don't tend to thrive when they're all by themselves. So the idea, what I'm getting at here is that, I'm going to just go back to this slide. We don't have our big parks on the East Coast and our forests anymore, but we do have these big, fabulous lawns that can be home to some really wonderful, beautiful plants that can help bring back some of these disappearing species. And just by the way, Japanese beetles, not native insects, and their favorite place to live is in big lawns. So as you lose your lawn, you'll lose your Japanese beetles. That's kind of a cool thing. So let's talk a little bit about the superpowers that these native plants have. Now that I've completely bummed everybody out, hopefully I'll make you happy with some of this information. So native plants, they provide food. That's what they do. Food for the birds, food for the bees, food for the butterflies, and Also cleansing for the watersheds, which I'll just say a brief word about. Not yet though. So first, food for the birds. This is just an amazing statistic. One native oak tree can support 534 Lepidoptera species. Lepidoptera is butterflies and moths. So one native oak tree can support just hundreds of different species. When you bring in a non-native tree, it can take thousands of years before the native insects can finally adapt to any non-native trees. So when there's no native trees and plants, that means we don't have our native insects, and that means we don't have our native birds. This is just another example. Eucalyptus trees, they're all over California. They were brought from Australia in the 1850s. They smell divine. In Australia, this tree can support 48 different species. In California, it supports one. So, you know, it's pretty, but if we're also interested in some, you know, helping our ecosystems, you know, maybe we want to consider planting some other things. We wouldn't plant eucalyptus trees here anyway. They really don't belong on the East Coast. So food for the birds. Planting native plants is also food for the bees. Bees do most of the pollination. Different types of bees associate with different types of plants. One size does not fit all. Females will sting in self-defense. Males do not sting. Bees do not they're not aggressive when they're foraging on flowers. And Doug Tallamy says, and you probably don't want to do this, but he says you can even pet a bee if you see it next to a flower. I'm not going to try that. You might be confusing yellow jackets. They do sting, and they're predatory wasps, but they're not the bees that we are talking about. Food for butterflies. So these are some pictures of butterfly weed. That provides lots of nectar, and it's the only plant, butterfly weed is the only plant that monarch caterpillars can eat. So if there's no butterfly weed, which used to cover the farmlands everywhere, no butterfly weed means no monarchs. So that's a huge reason why the monarchs are disappearing. And then swamp milkweed is another type of milkweed that likes, you know, wet soil. Also attracts butterflies and other pollinators. Butterfly weed is not to be confused with butterfly bush. And I'll say a word about butterfly bush in a minute. And then just since I mentioned watersheds, let me just say a quick word about them. Everybody lives in a watershed, right? If I gave you enough time to look at this slide, you'd be able to find your watershed. I live at the St. John's River watershed. And the thing about watersheds is every time it rains, all the water ultimately makes its way to our watershed. So on this picture, if you have a lawn, that means we're looking at the turf, and the turf has like very shallow roots. When you have deeper rooted native plants, what those do is they cleanse the water as it goes through the soil before it gets to the watershed. So native plants are also a really wonderful, wonderful solution to helping us clean up the quality of our water. All right, so we're going to take just a quick look at a couple of the bad guys. Now these were not bad guys in their, you know, where they first came from. They were fine, but then they came here. They didn't mean to be bad guys. It's just that they become bad guys. So for example, the butterfly bush. If it stayed where it was, where you planted it, it wouldn't be so bad. I used to have a butterfly bush covered with butterflies all the time. So beautiful. But the butterfly bush, it's like soda. It's like drinking Coca-Cola all the time for the butterflies. It is very non-nutritious nectar. And also, it has little dust-like seeds that very easily get carried through the wind. And it can become invasive. So it's something to really be careful of. These are some pictures from my backyard. I'm ashamed, but there it is. I thought Pachysandra were a wonderful ground cover. So that's what you see at the left with the Buddha up there. And the Pachysandra is not native. I don't ever see any kind of an insect hanging out there, and it spreads like crazy. The top right shows some vinca or periwinkle, also not native, also doesn't support any insects. And the bottom right, well, no, yeah, where is it? There's also mixed in here some English ivy, which also is insect-free and lifeless. So native Pachysandra, do I have that here? No, not yet. Native Pachysandra, there does some exist, and I'm going to tear out this bed and replace it with native Pachysandra. It's called Allegheny Pachysandra, and it does invite pollinators. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. So we're finally going to get to what you've been waiting for. At least I think this is what most of you guys have been waiting for. I can't ask you, so I'll assume. Now to get to the actual plants that are the superheroes, and plants that you can consider maybe putting in your own gardens. So before I say too much about it, you know, what is full sun, partial shade, shade? You know, generally speaking, and this is from the Penn State Extension, full sun is 6 or more hours, partial sun is 4 to 6 hours, partial shade is 2 to 4 hours, and shade is less than 2 hours. There's also mixtures, you know, dappled shade, and but those are the most important definitions. So this is a picture of Allegheny Pachysandra, which is native, and it's not as dense as the Japanese Pachysandra, but it is a lovely ground cover. It prefers generally to have mostly shady, part shade, and in the spring it does produce these beautiful flowers. So it's a very nice ground cover. This is a back alley. This is a fence, our fence in our back alley, and I'm slowly adding plants to it. These are all sun-loving plants. The tallest one is Joe Pieweed. There's Little Joe, there's Big Joe, there's a lot of different varieties. They're very similar, some get bigger. And they attract many pollinating insects, especially butterflies. The beautiful purple-ish flower is called aromatic aster, and that attracts long-tongued bees, short-tongued bees, who knew there were such bees, small to medium-sized butterflies, and skippers, which are sort of a type of moth. And then the goldenrod, you can't see it very well. There's a little bit of gold back there, but it also grows fairly tall. And it attracts something called a goldenrod soldier beetle, which sounds kind of gross, but it's not. It is a beneficial insect that will feed on the bad guys like aphids and maggots and, you know, some of the insects that you don't want. So there are good insects. Most insects are good that will eat up the bad insects that like to tear up your plants. Okay. So this is a row of ferns, and ferns are just really fabulous. Now they don't attract pollinators, but there are dozens and dozens of native ferns in this region. I think these are Christmas ferns. I should know that. And there's Christmas ferns that are evergreen year round. There's cinnamon ferns that smell like cinnamon. There's hay scented ferns that smell like hay. Now what they do is they create a beautiful ground cover, and then they also create habitat for insects, and I've even seen a few birds hanging out underneath, just hiding from predators. They definitely keep out the weeds. So I'm a big fan of ferns. They do need mostly shade. These are some baby ferns. The little fiddleheads over there are going to turn into a big fabulous fern in about 2 weeks. These flowers in front, these are called foam flowers, and I'm not trying to sell plants for Mount Cuba. These ones happen to be from Mount Cuba. They are believed to be insect pollinated. It's a little, we're not super sure about these guys, but they are native. They are a wonderful ground cover. 3 years ago, I planted just 3 of them. Not 3 years ago, 1 year ago, I planted 3, and they are just spreading like crazy, which I want. And when I say like crazy, they're not aggressive, but they're spreading exactly how I want them to. And they're very easy to divide as well. And then this is just a little close-up picture of the pretty little white flower. That's what these looked like about 2 weeks ago. This is a Heuchera, the type of Heuchera, and it's kind of a baby. That one hasn't gotten very big yet. They like shade also. Also can form a nice dense ground cover. Actually, you know what? They like shade and they like sun. They can grow pretty much anywhere. They're quite remarkable. There's a beautiful picture of all the, various Heucheras that, you can grow them all together and again in the sun or in the shade. They're lovely. I'm going to add a lot more to my garden. So this is one little tiny green, it's called green and gold, Chrysogonum virginianum. I will plant several more and it becomes a really lovely ground cover. And it is attractive to bees and fly pollinators. It's also deer resistant. Now I don't ever talk about, deer because we don't have any deer. I live in downtown Dover, but I know that's something that's really interesting to a lot of folks. This green and gold, it likes shade and it is a ground cover. This is one of my favorite new discoveries. It's not the greatest picture, but it's a trumpet honeysuckle. It's native honeysuckle. Okay, non-native honeysuckle is what most people are used to, which has that sweet smell, but that's not a native plant. So trumpet honeysuckle is native. I have seen hummingbirds whooshing around this plant. I'm going to plant a row of it. It is primarily attractive to hummingbirds. So you don't even need to hang out your hummingbird feeder anymore. Just plant a few of these guys. So this is moss phlox, Phlox subulata. I'm going to thank Debbie Nicole for these pictures. They're from her beautiful garden. They come in all sorts of colors. They provide pollen and nectar for various skippers, butterflies, and long-tongued bees, and they are deer resistant. It likes full sun. Moss phlox really likes full sun. Woodland phlox, now this is just a couple that I put in my garden about 3 weeks ago. This will spread just like the moss phlox, but this is phlox that likes the shade, and it grows a little taller than the moss phlox does. But it also is, it's pollinated by long-tongued bees and flies and butterflies and skippers and moths, and it's a really versatile little plant, and it's a ground cover as well. I'm really into ground covers because when we bought this property, it's covered in English ivy. So anything that I can replace the English ivy with, I have been experimenting with. Red columbine, it's a little shy. It takes a while to come up. It likes part shade to sun. It's an early source of nectar, and it also attracts ruby-throated hummingbirds, and it tends to be self-pollinated. So it's a lovely plant. I've planted it in a bunch of different places. One of the big mantras in master gardening is right plant, right place. And sometimes you have to experiment where that right place is. I've planted a bunch of these in various spots in my garden, and I'd say about half of the places it has liked. But you do want to pay attention to the full sun, part shade, descriptions generally, because if you plant a shade plant in the full sun, it will not be happy, and vice versa. And also just a word about soil. So I live in Kent County and the soil is clay. And so what grows in the soil in Kent County is going to be maybe different from Sussex County, which is sandier. And then as you get to northern Newcastle County, it's also very different. That's the Piedmont region. We're coastal, lower Delaware, and then you get up north and it's Piedmont, the Piedmont region. And I'll say a little bit more about that towards the end. So bugleweed. Now, when you have the word weed in the title of a plant, people are like, why would you plant a weed? So weed is just something that, you might not decide belongs where you put it. But this, I just looked at this today. I have a bunch of this throughout my yard now because, again, it's a ground cover. But it likes sun and it likes shade. It's happy anywhere. And you want to be careful. This one is native. You can tell that by the scientific name because it has virginicus. So it is, Virginia, native to the mid-Atlantic. But it has beautiful purple flowers today. And it attracts bees. So the good bees. Well, all the bees are good. It's the wasps that are a little scary. Coneflowers, everybody probably has seen coneflowers, also called Echinacea. So those are the purple flowers. And they attract yellow finches and butterflies and bees. So the birds, many different birds love the Echinacea, especially if you just leave it. As you can see on the right, I mean, some people would probably not think that's all that pretty, but my Echinacea, I didn't cut it back when I should have before it really started to grow last season. So I caged it and I leave all those seed heads there because the birds will come throughout the winter and still pick at it. So it's a pretty cool plant and it makes a lot of different species happy. The yellow flowers there are Coreopsis. Some people call it tickseed. And again, people say tick. Why would I plant something like that? But don't be misled by the name. It doesn't attract ticks, so I'm not sure why they call it tickseed. But it also attracts bees and butterflies. And these particular plants are sun lovers. This is a sedum. This one happens to be called Autumn Joy. And it's sort of a 4-season plant. And it also seems to do well in sun and some part shade. You can tell by the picture on the little tag what it looks like if you're not familiar with it. Right now, this is what it looks like, the little green curly things coming up. But it's a beautiful plant and it attracts butterflies and bees, and it provides interesting texture and all sorts of it's just a really nice plant. So I've got it all over the place. This is an excerpt that Doug Tallamy has given permission to use, and it's a list that is pulled from his book, one of his books. He's written several, and it's what he identifies as the top 20 most valuable woody and perennial native plant genera in terms of supporting biodiversity in the Mid-Atlantic region. So here's our oak tree over there. I can't use my cursor. The oak tree with all the Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths that it supports. You guys can read this yourselves. You're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint. I don't know how well this particular slide is going to come through, but these are all those trees. So those are trees on the left, and then sort of plants on the right. And that you can see all the numbers there. And some of the more common trees that we see around here, we see crabapple trees, elm trees, maple trees, pine trees, walnut trees, and so forth. On the right side, a lot of those I've talked about, the goldenrod, asters. I didn't mention sunflowers. They're similar to the aster family. Joe Pye, Morning glory, make sure it's the real morning glory and not the weed that looks like a morning glory. There's a weed called bindweed that is atrocious and really hard to get rid of. So you want to make sure you're really planting the native morning glory. Sedges, honeysuckle, the trumpet honeysuckle, lupines, violets, geraniums. You want to make sure they're the native geraniums. They're not, that's not the geraniums usually that we get, you know, at the local nursery. Black-eyed Susans, irises, native irises. And then they've got evening primrose, milkweed, verbena, beard tongue, phlox, bee balm, veronica, little blue stem, and cardinal flower. Most of those I've experimented with, and most of them I have had some good success. So now it's your turn to be a superhero, right? We've talked about how the native plants are superheroes, but they can only do what they do if we plant them. So obviously, solution number one is plant them, right? Plant them wherever you can plant them. This is this was an assignment for the Master Gardening Program to create a design. So this is my what my back patio will look like by the end of this summer. And those are my list of native plants, most of which I've talked about with you guys. So I made my little design. So even if you live in an apartment building with a balcony, you can plant a container garden that has pollinators in it. They thrive. They do very well in containers. So don't be put off if you don't have much space. You can absolutely do this. It'll be something lovely to look at as you sit on your balcony. And you definitely want to make sure if you're planting milkweed, and I hope you'll consider it, that it is native. You need to make sure you ask your garden store where their milkweed comes from, because butterfly milkweed is, or butterfly weed, it's plentiful in the big box stores. I won't name any names, but the big box stores tend to get their milkweed from a species that's native to Mexico. And the Mexican butterfly weed is called Asclepias curasavica. And that is not what our native milkweed is called. And the difference is small. The Mexican milkweed has a slightly higher level of toxicity, and that our monarchs cannot tolerate very well. So you want to make sure that it's the right native milkweed for us. So this is where knowing that scientific name comes in handy. Usually we can get away with just saying, hey, do you have any Joe Pye weed? But if you're asking for something that has lots of varieties, you want to make sure you also have that scientific name with you. And again, don't confuse butterfly weed with butterfly bush. And then the other thing to keep in mind is when you're planting your flowers or your trees, strive to plant a variety. The more variety, the more insects and birds you're going to be attracting. So a variety is great. A lot of people, after reading some of this information, especially reading Doug Tallamy's book, a lot of people have been like eager to go. If I'm going to plant one tree, I'm going to plant an oak tree. You want to plant a variety, and if we all just go out and plant oak trees, then we are probably inviting some diseases. So when there's variety, there's less opportunity for diseases to strike as well. So many local nurseries, I kind of slammed the big box stores. They're getting better. The big box stores still do, however, sell plants that have been treated. They've been grown with this pesticide that's called, I won't be able to say it right, but it's neonicotinoid. It's a type of pesticide that they're grown. I went to buy blueberry bushes from a local big box store 2 or 3 years ago, and I read the label, and the really tiny print said treated with neonicotinoid, and I couldn't believe it. And if you know, there is a link between pesticides and some of the decline in some of these species. So if you want to plant blueberry bushes because you want to bring in blue jays and other animals, then you want to make sure it hasn't been treated with some of those kinds of chemicals. So the local nurseries, they have native plants that have not been treated with these kinds of chemicals. So, you know, if you go to your favorite nursery and they don't have native plants, or they don't have the one you're looking for, just ask them. Well, ask them why they don't have it, and then they'll, you know, if 2 people call for it, they're going to start ordering them. It's all a matter of supply and demand. So ask and you shall receive. I'm including a few of these links here for you to find more information. So when you are researching native plants, make sure you identify the Mid-Atlantic as your region. And really different experts, you know, some will say the entire East Coast is one region. Some will divide north from south. Your best bet is if you focus primarily on Mid-Atlantic. And that can span a pretty big distance, but Mid-Atlantic is going to get you probably the most success. And as I said a few minutes ago, most of Delaware is in the coastal region as opposed to the Piedmont region, which is part of northern Newcastle County. When you are doing your research, you really try to include the word extension in the site. So, I mean, you can just type in Joe Pieweed, extension, and you'll get, you know, fully researched, good, reliable information that comes from extension services. And the extension services are all about educating the public based on good science. So any question you want to ask about gardening, you ask the question, extension, and you're going to get some really good information. Mount Cuba, I mentioned them earlier. They have, if you just type in their website, they have a native plant finder. If you want to learn more about something, and you can just type in black-eyed Susans, and they'll give you all the information you need for, you know, does it need sun or shade, what kind of soil, what time of year does it bloom, and so forth. So that's a really nice website. This University of Maryland website, it's an extension website, also has a tremendous wealth of information about Mid-Atlantic native plants. And then Chesapeake Bay Native Plant Center also, I discovered that one, and that one, they're not trying to sell you plants. They are a good vetted place to also find more information. So this took a little quicker since I don't have live people to engage with. Well, you're live, but you know what I mean. But the point is, they're not just, I think they're beautiful, but native plants are also, they literally save lives. And it's definitely my hope that, you know, you go out and you stock up on some really lovely plants, and then you enjoy watching the birds and the bees and the butterflies come and have some fun in your yard. So that is the end of my presentation. And I think some of you guys have been sending questions. So I'm going to turn this over now to Debbie, I think. And I guess I probably should stop my share. And Debbie, you're muted.
Hi.
There you are. Hi.
Hi. We did have a couple of questions. I believe that Carla has been on it. She's been answering them in the chat.
Oh.
But, I will also share those with you. So we had a question from Beth, and she wanted to know if ferns needed a lot of moisture. And Carla has said that some, like Christmas fern and hay-scented fern, are somewhat drought tolerant. I don't know if that answered the question, but Carla, if you want to say anything, we can unmute you. I can find you. So you can join.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
You are.
Okay. A lot of ferns do like moisture, and you know, even ones like the hay-scented or Christmas fern, which I've grown in areas that, you know, didn't get any supplemental watering, and they've done just fine even through the droughts of the summer. But I think most of them would probably appreciate if you did give them moisture. They may not, a lot of ferns will brown out in the middle of summer, but once they start getting moisture, they may revive and put out some new growth. I hope that helps anybody.
Beth, did that answer your question? Yeah, you can talk, Beth.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay, and you had
Oh, good.
you
Okay.
had another question about where to find native milkweed, and I believe that Carla, would you like to address that also?
Well, I think that Megan also put in, I know that Adkins Arboretum is still holding their sale, but it's going to be by order only. Now, whether they'll ship, that I am not really sure, honestly. Around here, there are some native plant nurseries. There's one up near Heuchera, and let me see. If you look around, mostly online, I think is your best bet at this point for finding native milkweed or any other native, since it's impossible to go traveling out of state at this point.
I was having the same thought,
would
Carla.
say
Online, I think online is going to be the
What's
best
that?
bet for buying native plants right now, just because we can't travel.
Right, exactly.
well, can I just say that when we can travel, there are almost every nursery in Kent County is starting to sell more and more native plants. So you can call them and see if they've got what you're looking for.
Right, I think I agree with that. And I see Beth, Prairie Moon, that is a good source.
And if anybody else has any questions, if you want to put them in the chat feature, or if you want to just, if we could be unmuted one at a time if you want to ask your question out loud. Is there any other questions? Okay, any flowers? Love tree canopy.
But do you mean by that plants that will grow in the shade?
Yes. I
Okay.
like to put some flowers underneath big trees.
Okay, growing plants under trees. The phlox divaricata that Kathy had mentioned earlier, Woodland Phlox, that's really good. There's bloodroot. Bloodroot is kind of a spring ephemeral, which means it blooms, you know, in the spring and then kind of goes dormant, although I've noticed that the foliage has stayed visible pretty much all season. Let me think. Trying to think of some other, the green and gold, the Crixogonum, that is a vigorous ground cover. Give it some room if you're going to grow it, but it will take sun or shade. It's not terribly picky. It seems to grow in a droughty location as well as a moister location. There's Pachysandra aurea, which is also known as golden ragwort. There again, it's a fairly vigorous ground cover, and Kathy, I was going to suggest you put that in instead of the Pachysandra.
Oh.
It's blooming right now. It has little yellow daisy-like flowers, and it'll bloom for about 2-3 weeks, maybe even a month, depending on how cool it is. And it stays evergreen. Well, not evergreen through the winter, but it will stay through the rest of till late fall before it goes dormant. There are a couple of types of wood asters that do well in the shade. Let's see. Bleeding hearts, dwarf bleeding hearts, like Dicentra. They'll grow in the shade and they reseed themselves and form nice patches. I hope that helps you with at least a list to get started with.
Okay, Carla, we have another question about drought resistant. Are there any drought resistant native plants?
A lot of them, actually. The Pecora aurea, the chrysogonum that I've mentioned already, they're quite drought resistant. For sun, coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, they'll take a decent amount of drought. I don't water much of anything in my front yard because it's kind of awkward. And those things have done pretty well through droughts in the summer.
Yeah, I also have coneflowers growing in the woods behind my house. I threw out a lot of wildflower seed, and that was really the only thing that came up from seed.
Right. Asters do pretty well after a while, and you'll see by their foliage if they're really needing some water, because they will definitely start looking wilty. But they will take some drought tolerance.
Okay, we had a question from Phil Elliott. He wants to know about landscapers that work with native plants, and Megan recommended to him that he look for landscapers that are in the Delaware Nursery and Landscape Association and ask them about landscaping with native plants.
By the way, I see Carla Wilson has asked about blue false indigo, Baptisia. Yes, it is native. They're coming out with a lot of hybrids that are really very nice. The straight species is okay also. It develops a deep taproot, so if you want to plant it, make sure you like where it's going to be, because it's hard to transplant from what I understand. We have some growing in the berm garden at the Paradis Center. It'll bloom. Usually the straight species blooms blue or yellow, although there is also a white form. And it blooms in the spring, and then at when it starts setting seed, it develops like almost like pea pods, which can be considered ornamental. So yeah, that's another good one, and that definitely is drought tolerant as well.
Okay, and Janella just said that she has posted a picture of golden ragwort on the Kent Master Gardener Facebook page if anybody wants to take a look at that.
Yeah, it's a beauty. It really is a nice plant.
And then we have another question that's, are there azaleas that like sun and are native?
Yes, actually. Now, normally the azaleas that are native are going to be the deciduous azaleas, but azalea calendulaceum actually is quite sun tolerant. They're found on the tops of mountains in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They bloom in shades from yellow, orange, red, in that range. They do get pretty big, so give them some space. but they definitely will tolerate sun. Let me think. There are some other native azaleas. I've got one. It's a hybrid called Pennsylvania. It's in my garden out front in full sun. Right now it's loaded with buds.
Mm.
Now, when they are in sun, you may want to give them a little supplemental water, though, if it's drought during the middle of the summer.
We have a question are there any native peonies?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I think all peonies come from Asia.
Okay, any other questions, anybody? Is anemone native?
Let's see. I'm mostly familiar with the Japanese ones. I'm not really actually sure that there are any native anemones.
Okay, is there any more questions? I don't see any more coming up right now.
I think that there are some native anemones, but I think you would want to do a little more research on that.
Okay, well, if nobody has any more questions, we're going to close out here, and you will receive a copy of this presentation in your email in probably 5 or 10 minutes, along with an evaluation form that's online. That's pretty much the one we always use if you've been to our workshops before, only it's going to be done on the computer instead of on paper. So if you don't mind giving us some feedback and filling that out, it's completely anonymous. So just, be honest. This is our first try with an online workshop. Tell us what you like and what you don't like. And if you have any suggestions, because we will be doing more of these. We have the tomato workshop coming up in May, and there may be some more surprises coming. So keep an eye out for that. Hope you enjoyed the online version of our class, and we hope that we'll see you back for more.